I've been playing the Switch 2 since it released, like what, a week ago now? And I keep coming back to this comment that I saw on my friend Bill's YouTube channel. This commenter, Dan Taub, said, I think the Switch 2 is asking too much, but giving too little in return. Somehow this got me thinking about my first week with the Switch 2 and now comparing it to my first week with the Steam Deck. And the thing that I've settled on is that it's about quality versus ambition. Switch 2 at launch is a pretty high quality product. It has a solid amount of polish. The UI is still very streamlined. The build quality is amazing. Like everyone else, I love the magnets on the Joy-Cons, and the hinge on the kickstand is primo. The thing is, although I would say the Switch 2 is high quality, I would also say it lacks ambition. On the other hand, the Steam Deck is a quality product too, but I would argue not to the level of polish that the Switch 2 has. And honestly, that first week of the Steam Deck, it had even less quality than it does now. It was high-key riddled with small problems, but despite that relative lack of quality, I was extremely impressed with my Steam Deck even in my first week of playing it, and that is all down to its ambition. The Steam Deck was an incredibly ambitious project, a PC handheld with good performance, reasonable battery life, and to be honest, an unbeatable number of input options, at least that we've seen to this point. It also combined the worlds of console gaming and PC gaming like nothing has been able to do. It's a great middle ground between the ease of a console and the flexibility of a PC. And maybe you think that holding the Switch 2 to that standard is unfair. After all, the first Switch was just as ambitious as the Steam Deck, if not even more. Plus, if we ever do see a Steam Deck 2, then maybe that will be more like the Switch 2, more of an evolution than a revolution, as my friend Russ said. So maybe this is all contrary to popular opinion, but I think it's reasonable to hold Nintendo to a higher standard than what they delivered here, which honestly is still pretty good. I'm not saying that Nintendo had to go out and release something that would alienate folks like the Wii U did. That is a false choice. It's not a decision between the Wii U struggles and something safe, just like it's not actually a choice between quality and ambition. Nintendo has the money and resources to deliver on both ambition and quality, and I think they chose to forego ambition almost altogether. Mario Kart World is kind of the exact same. This is their big launch title that they're charging $80 for, and overall I would say that MKW is an extremely sound game, especially in the context of being a Mario Kart. It's a really good Mario Kart. But Nintendo could have done more than just create a really good Mario Kart, especially if they're going to charge $80 for it. And that's where I go back to that comment from Dan Taub. I think the Switch 2 is asking for too much, but giving too little in return. So in the context of Mario Kart World, Nintendo is asking for a dollar amount that breaks the status quo, but giving you a game that is about as status quo as it gets. That right there is a microcosm of how I feel about the Switch 2. I imagine we're at the point in this video where you all might be wondering, well, Rich, what could Nintendo have done for you to say the Switch 2 was both high quality and ambitious? I'm glad you asked. I've been waiting for someone to say, hey, what does Rich think about all of this? So I'm going to throw some ideas out at you, and I want you to tell me if they're reasonable. I think you'll find that these are ideas that would have kept the Switch 2 from being another Wii U, but would have felt more like an upgrade than what we have now. And to be clear, it's not that Nintendo should have done all of these things that I'm going to say. These are just some ideas. But that's kind of my point. I really feel like Nintendo didn't entertain ideas other than, let's say, mouse mode, which I genuinely do believe to be ambitious, despite not having any good killer app for it yet. But yeah, other than mouse mode, Nintendo didn't entertain ideas. They were just kind of like, yeah, people will buy this, ship it. So let me go ahead and give you some examples. Backwards compatibility on the Switch 2 is good. It's actually really good. Games that don't reach the frame rate cap on Switch 1 have increased frame rates on Switch 2, at least for the most part. And if a game has dynamic resolution scaling on the Switch 1, then even the image quality can be improved on the Switch 2. But games with dynamic resolution scaling are actually not the norm. They're more like the exception for the original Switch. Most games on the OG Switch have one resolution for handheld mode and then another higher resolution for docked mode. So the thing that Switch 2 could have done to improve handheld image quality for almost every Switch 1 game is allow you to force docked mode. It's true that some games have changed functionality in docked mode, like Mario Maker 2, where you would lose the ability to edit levels with the touchscreen, but I think it still would have been a net benefit if the Switch 2 gave you this option so that you can get an increased resolution and take advantage of the new display on the new hardware. Some people may say this could have been confusing to users, but I trust Nintendo to communicate this effectively to their buyers. I mean, worst case scenario, they could have tucked this into some sort of advanced menu just like the Steam Deck does. The Steam Deck doesn't allow you to force dock mode per se, but instead it just doesn't differentiate between docked and handheld and opts to give you fine-tuned control over how much power you would like to use. Now, in the context of the launch of the Switch 2, I really have to say that I find the absence of analog triggers particularly conspicuous. Mario Kart is a game that would have benefited from analog triggers. Of course, Mario Kart has never used triggers for acceleration, but it could, right? Analog triggers have been bog standard in video game controllers since Sega introduced them almost 30 years ago. Even so, they would have felt like a welcome upgrade in the transition from the Switch to the Switch 2. And what better way to showcase that upgrade than to have your big launch game, Mario Kart, use the triggers for the first time ever in the franchise to accelerate? This seems like an obvious and seamless way to introduce your audience to relatively new controls, as opposed to charging $10 for a tech demo. The other reason analog triggers are conspicuous by their absence is because this is the console that is introducing GameCube emulation to the Nintendo Classics collection. Nintendo Classics is the branding for what is Nintendo's retro gaming solution. They charge you a monthly subscription to access their emulated back catalog of games, and up until now, they've supported systems like NES, SNES, Game Boy, and Game Boy Color. If you pay Nintendo even more per month, then they'll throw in games from Nintendo 64, Game Boy Advance, and even the Sega Genesis. They call this higher tier the expansion pack, which is an adorable name because it plays on the extra fee that they charged you in a Nintendo 64 era to effectively download more RAM. Nonetheless, the Switch 2 is the exclusive platform on which to play GameCube games using Nintendo Classics. Was the Switch 1 powerful enough to emulate GameCube games? Well, yeah, sure it was. Possibly not the entire GameCube collection, but there are a number of games on the Switch 1 that are just emulated GameCube games. Super Mario 3D All-Stars has 2 of them on the same cart. Well, it has one GameCube game and one game that released for the 2 GameCubes ducked together console. Pikmin 1 and 2 is another pair of emulated games on a single Switch 1 cart. So certainly the Switch 1 could emulate at least some GameCube games, but no, the entire collection of GameCube games for Nintendo Classics is going to be locked onto their new platform, even if you are already paying them the higher amount per month. Which, fine, but they at least could have made this transaction more appetizing by having Switch 2 hardware have analog triggers as a standard. Analog triggers aren't necessarily used in every GameCube game, but they are critical in some of them, specifically F-Zero GX, which is actually one of just 3 games that have been added to this collection at launch. In Nintendo's materials, you can see Wind Waker, amazing game, but kind of unbelievable that they're selling us this game for the 5th time. You can see F-Zero GX, awesome game as well, and Soul Calibur 2, an absolute classic. So yeah, this is a banger lineup, but unlike the Mario Kart series, having an analog trigger is actually really extremely important to the gameplay of F-Zero GX. It's not used for acceleration, it's used for a drift mechanic that slides you a bit over to the left or a bit over to the right. And to be honest, this is a mechanic that I would argue requires the finesse of an analog trigger even more than if it were for acceleration and braking. But don't worry, if you love giving Nintendo obscene amounts of money, then they have a solution for you because they will sell you a GameCube controller for $65, and that one does have analog triggers. So in summary, if you want to reasonably play GameCube games, you just have to buy the new console, pay the higher tier of the monthly subscription, and buy a special controller that happens to be sold out. I really, and I mean desperately don't want to spend this entire video talking about Nintendo gouging us for dollars because it's been done to death, but it goes back to that original comment that Switch 2 is asking too much, but giving too little in return. Everyone's personal threshold is going to be different, but for me personally, it wouldn't quite feel as obscene if Nintendo had just included analog triggers. I was never going to buy the GameCube controller anyway, and look, like I said, it is sold out. So clearly what Nintendo is doing is working, it's going to continue to work, but this video isn't to echo the popular sentiment that Nintendo will in fact make lots of money. That should be pretty much self-evident at this point. Just that once again, I think it's fair to hold Nintendo to a higher standard and say, hey, you can do better. And I think it's fair to acknowledge that Nintendo is asking for a lot and giving very little in return. All right, I spent a lot more time on analog triggers than I expected, and so I'm going to make these other ambitious ideas shorter. The next one is the form factor. I would argue that the Switch 2 is a huge improvement on the form factor of the Switch 1, but I do still find it uncomfortable to hold for long periods of time. I know most people don't have that same problem, so I'm not going to belabor the point, but I do want to reference two products that I think have objectively better ergonomics than the current version of the Switch 2. The first is actually an accessory for the original Switch. It's called the Nitro Deck. Mind you, I am aware that some people have experienced faulty Nitro Decks, so this accessory is not all roses, but as far as comfort goes, I love it. It's basically a case or a dock, depending on how you look at it, that you slide your Switch tablet into, and it gives you much improved controls and ergonomics. Part of the reason I didn't want to turn this into a video about Nintendo charging money for things is because I would pay money if Nintendo released their own Nitro Deck style accessory. But again, that's because it's not about charging money, it's about what you get for that money. To that end, and given that I'm not against the current Joy-Cons kind of being the default standard, I think it would be fair to release a Pro style handheld dock as a separate accessory. Thankfully, we probably will see something similar soon from third parties. The original Nitro Deck released late in the Switch's life, but now it's a thing, and so it's going to be a no-brainer for other third parties to copy, and of course the original manufacturers have confirmed that they are working on a follow-up for the Switch 2. Likewise, and I'm sure this is going to be a controversial one, but I think the PS Portal might be the perfect handheld as far as ergonomics go. No, it's not easily packable in a bag the way the Switch 2 is, so there's that, but I have a lot of handhelds and the PS Portal is by far the most comfortable to hold and to look at thanks to the big screen. And so when you compare the PS Portal and the Switch 2, the display is nearly the exact same size, which is why it came to mind, and the weight is almost the exact same, which is also why it came to mind. I love the screen on the Switch 2, and coming from PC handhelds, I really love how light it is as well. So yeah, this new Switch matches the Portal in both of those key areas, but it's not nearly as comfortable to play games on over long periods of time, and that's something that Nintendo could have addressed. It's something that I would feel would be seen as an upgrade by most buyers. Again, they don't necessarily need to replace the current Joy-Con standard, but let's call them Pro-style Joy-Cons. You know, I remember, and I don't know if I'm making this up, but I remember so many gamers being optimistic back when the OG Switch launched about how Joy-Cons could be modular, right? Like the flat Joy-Cons would be perfect for travel, but maybe you'd have beefier Joy-Cons with a real D-pad and bigger buttons for using your handheld at home. And thankfully, this was another gap that third parties did attempt to fill last generation. The Hori Split Pad Pro came highly recommended for big-handed gamers like myself. But personally, I don't know why Nintendo hasn't capitalized on the freedom that they've given themselves with the Joy-Cons, which could be so modular. Take the Aya Neo 3, for example. It's a PC handheld where everything on it is modular. You can use a micro switch D-pad with 6 face buttons if you want to play fighters, or if you love Steam controllers, you can try going to dual trackpad format, or of course you can just be a normie and stick to dual analog. In a way, this is ridiculous, I get it, but it's also ambitious. And I think Nintendo could have made it a lot less ridiculous if they did it, right? If they had their level of quality with Aya Neo's level of, let's say, ambition. On that note of modularity, I think Nintendo could have likewise incorporated a vertical mode for Switch 2. There are games on the Switch 1 that can be played vertically, games like Downwell and old school arcade games like ESP Galuda 2. There was even an accessory made by a grassroots creator called the Flip Grip. This allowed you to play the Switch vertically with the tablet sliding into the middle of the accessory and the Joy-Con sliding into the outer part of the accessory. This made for a nice, comfortable way to have a novel experience with the Switch and with vertical games. So I think that this level of modularity would have made a ton of sense for Nintendo and could have more easily opened up their back catalog of dual screen games from platforms like DS, 3DS, and even Wii U. And it doesn't just have to be back catalogs of games. I actually personally would not mind if Nintendo ended up making a few weird vertical mode games. You know, it must not be hard to tell from this video that I'm a big fan of novelty, and that's kind of what I feel is lacking here. A Switch 1 to Switch 2 upgrade is nice, but it's not novel. And that brings me back to the Steam Deck. The Steam Deck was ambitious, it was novel. Valve and Nintendo are companies with lots of money, and sure, sometimes there are small companies with very little money that have to make serious trade-offs when they aim for novelty. The Playdate, for example, is incredibly novel, but a black and white tiny handheld with no backlight and a crank as one of the main inputs can never be a mainstream system in 2025. Sometimes though, we apply this notion of trade-offs to bigger companies, billion-dollar companies. We behave as though Nintendo has to choose between evolution and revolution, or they have to choose between iteration and innovation, or they have to choose between quality and ambition, and I just don't think they do. Like, even if you think my ideas here are shit, and maybe they are, these are just ideas. You've probably heard that Henry Ford quote where he said, if I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. Nintendo has most certainly given us a faster horse with the Switch 2, and in that way, they nailed it, right? The backwards compatibility is awesome, and if you ask people what they wanted, I'm guessing it would have been exactly this. But only like 4 people wanted a Steam Deck before it came out, and now we all have a podcast together. By this point, it's probably over 4 million sold, and that's going to sound like peanuts when you compare it to the Switch 2, but I think the future of gaming kind of looks a lot more like the Steam Deck and less like the Switch 2. What do you think? Tech Hangout. Goodbye.